Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We've got Marco del Giudice now. This is a very interesting topic on life history, which runs throughout today's discussions and has been a particular interest of Riyad and myself. And I'm only sorry he couldn't make it over here in person, but it was something to do with getting his visa or from Italy, which was not happening. So anyway, can I introduce Professor Marco del Giudice, who's going to talk on life history theory. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me in spirit. It's going to be the first time I do a presentation this way. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah. He has nothing. So we tried to install a special Italian package to share the hand movements, but didn't work out. So you just hear my voice. Let me share the screen. So the topic of my presentation is not specifically on the explanation of mental disorder and psychopathology. It's a bit more broad. It's a broader topic, and it's about evolutionary contributions to understanding the the broad structure of mental disorders. And right now, there are a few interesting problems in this area and some interesting answers. And I will present them briefly and then make my case for a slightly different approach. So of course, the landscape is still dominated by the DSM taxonomy, which tries in a sense to be atheoretical. This is going to be, of course, kind of unsatisfactory in the long run. I won't even go over this. One of the problems with DSM that is widely recognized but very hard to do something about it is many of the diagnostic categories are very heterogeneous. So, and Daniel, I listened, so I was able to tune in with Daniel's talk, so I know some of the things you've been talking about so far. And heterogeneity is not dealt with in any principled way in the DSM. Then, more worryingly, I mean, there's massive levels of comorbidity between disorders, and yet the DSM doesn't have any large-scale model that accounts for that. So there are lists of comorbidities, there's a kind of network structure to it, but there's no, again, principled way to account for it in the DSM system. And there's other limitations I won't go over. Currently, the three main responses to these, the main answers are, the first is probably more popular in the US right now, but the RDoC, the Research Domain Criteria from the NIH, where the attempt is to start over from scratch. And the idea is to look at specific constructs that come from mainly animal research, neurobiological research. It's a bottom-up approach. The focus on brain circuits, defined in different ways, with this multi-level approach that goes from genes to behavior and self-report. It's, again, probably interesting in the long run, but right now the coverage is extremely patchy. And from a functional biological perspective, it's incredibly strange that, for example, mating and sexual behavior are not even included in the main neurobiological constructs in the RDoC. So it's clearly very patchy, not well organized at the moment. And again, while it's trying to rebuild the entire understanding of mental disorder from the bottom up, there's no account of large-scale comorbidity. So this is useless for now to kind of resolve the problem of structure. The second answer that's also very interesting is network models. Daniel talked about that in detail, so the idea here is that disorders kind of dissolve into a network of self-reinforcing symptoms, each symptom causing other symptoms and so on. You have bridge symptoms that connect disorders, but the reality of disorders in a way get dissolved into this dynamic system. And the idea for depression could be something like that. So you have somatic and cognitive and emotional symptoms reinforcing and causing each other. The real life example of it, and this is a bigger one. One of the studies that tried to go beyond a single disorder and just do a large scale reanalysis of the structure of psychopathology. Okay, so this approach I think has much value. and potentially can bring depth and refinement to some ways of thinking that are a bit too simplistic about how disorders come about. There are some methodological difficulties that have not been sorted out yet. Have to do with replication and stability of the networks. There's also some assumptions that may or may not be warranted about the, again, for example, the sparsity of networks and so on. One thing that's a bit more worrying to me is that the field, this network approach has tended to focus so far on a pure symptom networks, so in which there's really no latent factors connecting the symptoms, it's all symptoms causing each other. And I think the rationale for that is really, really weak. So it's attractive from a purely psychometric perspective, but I don't think it's going to hold water. If you think of something, for example, like just think about cortisol, changes in some neurophysiological parameters, they can act pretty much as latent factors in this sense. They can affect multiple behaviors and symptoms at the same time. So just getting rid of any lower level causal factors, I think it's a bit an extreme move, probably not going to work too well. And then this is another interesting aspect. So the few studies so far that have tried to map the large-scale structure of symptoms using a network approach come out with structures that are not that terribly different from the DSM. And you have one example here on this slide. That might depend a little bit on the quality of data that are available now, but we still don't know if this approach is going to give you radically different answers when it comes to the large-scale relations between symptoms and disorders. Third approach, again with a lot of strong points and some notable weak points, is I call it this transdiagnostic model. And this has a slightly longer history. And the idea here is you have broad dimensions of risk for different categories of disorders or symptoms. And the classic distinction is between the externalizing and internalizing disorders. And more recently, there's been a resurgence of the idea of a general factor, basically underlying a very generalized risk for psychopathology across the board. It's being christened P factor in a famous study by Caspi and others. Has been replicated any number of times, so it's a pretty robust statistical finding. What the P factor, the correlates of the P factor, to try to understand what it is about, it does. This general factor of risk correlates with low IQ, low indices of reduced neural integrity, some personality traits like low agreeableness, conscientiousness, of course, high neuroticism, and then it correlates also with some environmental measure like socioeconomic stress and childhood adversity and so on. It's a finding that's not just there at the level of phenotypes. This is one study I'm going to talk more about in a minute. That shows you can, again, recover a decent general factor from, for example, genetic data, polygenic scores, and other ways to summarize genetic components. From other studies, we know that this general factor is about 40% heritable, and there's parallel between the phenotypic and the genetic structure of it. Here's a so the original transdiagnostic model has a internalizing, externalizing plus general factor structure, and there are elaborations that try to make it a bit more comprehensive and a bit more sophisticated. This model has been at least institutionally very successful recently, and is the high-top model, in which there are 7 key kind of middle-level dimensions capturing clusters of disorders, and then higher order dimensions including the P factor. So this approach is, I think, again, it's a bit the opposite of the network approaches right now. It starts from top-down. It's really a top-down approach that starts from summarizing correlations, phenotypic correlations between symptoms and disorders, and it's doing a better job of accounting for the large-scale structure of psychopathology. Another good thing about it is there are explicit links with normal variation in personality. So it's grounded in theories and models of normal variation. It's not just a model of psychopathology. At the same time, there are limitations. One big limitation is it's almost exclusively inductive. It's built from correlations. There's not a lot of thinking about why the clusters and the correlations should hang out the way they do. So it's theoretically superficial in a certain way. And the other thing right now, again, pretty big limitation that's not been addressed is that it takes disorders like the constructs from the DSM pretty much at face value. So it does a good job of summarizing clusters of disorders in a certain way, but it doesn't really account for heterogeneity within disorders. So that's slightly worrying aspect of it. Because if the disorders are actually heterogeneous to a big extent, the structure you get from moving from disorders up might actually muddle things rather than explain them. So there's a lot of promise in all these three approaches, and still some limitation that it would be nice to get them to work together. So what's the view from evolutionary psychiatry? Well, one really nice thing about this approach, we have all sorts of models and ideas and hypotheses about individual disorders and symptoms. It's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. There's all sorts of reasons, and here's a scheme I made at some point, to a lot of reasons and causal pathways that might lead to things we call disorders. And going all the way from pure harmful dysfunction, where there's a malfunctioning mechanism, to potentially adaptive traits and clusters of traits that are viewed as disorders, even if they are biologically adaptive, and a lot of stuff in between. So I don't have to argue with you that there are many really useful insights coming from this approach. The field as a whole still has some important limitations. One is there's generally a lack of integration between models of specific symptoms and disorders. So there's models of depression, of schizophrenia, of autism, of anxiety disorders, of OCD. Integration is still at a very, very preliminary stage. Also, if you look at the field from the perspective of development, there's something lacking. A lot of the work is focused on this kind of adult-centric view of psychopathology. There's not a lot of attention to development, and also there's not a lot of interaction with one of the most interesting, in my view, areas of research of NAC, which is genetics. Okay, and to go back to the initial question, so our field so far has really failed, despite some early attempts, to produce a model of comorbidity that can account and make sense not just of individual symptoms and disorders, but something about large-scale structure. And because the large-scale structure is so it's so powerful, comorbidities are high, they are patterned. I actually don't think we can claim to understand a lot about disorders until we can account for the broad patterns of covariation. So this is where I'm going to start. And I propose that we can make headway on this important problem by taking a life history perspective. So I'm not going to even attempt to give you a detailed or comprehensive account of life history theory. I'm just going to give a cartoonish sketch of the logical path we following. So the basic problem in life history theory is organisms have to allocate resources like energy and time to competing fitness components. This results in a number of trade-offs. For example, between reproduction, so investing energy in reproduction, including mating and parenting, versus growing a bigger body and repairing tissues and protecting body against, for example, infections and so forth. Within reproduction, there is a trade-off between, in species where there are mating and parenting, between the investment in mating effort and investment in caring for the young who are already born, so mating versus parenting. I would argue especially important in species like humans. There are trade-offs between current and future reproduction that have to do with maturation timing and the age of reproduction too. And then these trade-offs, to some extent, connect to the quantity and quality of investment in offspring. So there is a pervasive quantity versus quality approach. And of course, these trade-offs can be more or less complex and interdependent depending on the species. You don't expect them to work exactly the same way in all species on Earth, but they are pretty, recurrent problems for organisms to solve. And at a large scale, it's been documented as a broad pattern between species, so-called the fast-slow life history continuum, where you see you can basically sort species from a short lifespan, species that grow faster, reproduce early, and have many offspring with relatively low investment, versus species in which lifespan is long, growth is low, reproduction is delayed, and there's high investment in fewer offspring. And life history continuum is, again, it's not describing the whole thing, is an empirical generalization mainly. And there's some, again, with provisions and still a lot to figure out about the details, but the general idea that when there's environments and ecologies are dangerous and unpredictable, past life histories can pay off more, and slow life history only makes sense when the environment is sufficiently stable and predictable. Now the idea, and this has been done in evolutionary psychology quite a bit, is to move from the between species perspective to the within species perspective and argue that life history trade-offs shape development and behavior and might have to do with individual differences, not just with species difference. That adds a layer of complexity. I'm not going to go into the details of how you can do that. I'm just going to present, the idea is that to the extent that within a species, you have some of the same trade-offs, for example, between investment in mating versus parenting and early versus late reproduction. Those trade-offs are going to have implications for development and behavior. And a lot of behaviors that might not be immediately related to, for example, mating. There's, of course, mating competition, social sexuality, but also things like risk-taking, things like impulsivity, and things like, for example, even sensitivity to disgust, which might fit into regulation of mating and other things. And of course, also traits that affect mortality, traits that affect the chances of reproducing earlier or later. So the idea is that if we can reconstruct something like the fast-slow continuum within our species, we can use that as one possible functional organizing principle of individual differences. And this is what I summarized like the a bit of a, what I call it basic model, because I'm actually proposing we need something a bit more complex. But there's, I think, substantial support for the idea that traits, for example, like impulsivity, risk-taking, unrestricted social sexuality, unstable attachments, and low level of affiliation, cooperation, and empathy with personality traits like low agreeableness, low conscientiousness, those traits tend to favor things like lower survival, higher mortality, and higher investment in mating at the expense of parenting, and the opposite at the other hand. So I'm taking a relatively narrow approach to individual differences. So I'm not trying to lump everything in one big dimension. I'm just arguing that there is enough consistency that the fast-slow continuum is, robust enough to give you a functional principle. It's not the only functional principle, but it's something that, if it works, is broad enough that it can serve as kind of the broader foundation on which we can hope to build a model of individual differences. And if that works for normative individual differences, because mental disorders are definitely not independent from variation on those dimensions, we can hope to move from a broad pattern for organizing and creating a large-scale map of individual differences to a map of psychopathology. This was my initial proposal. So the idea, we can, we can sort individual differences to some extent on this fast versus low dimension. We can try to sort disorders on the same pattern based on the personality, motivational, cognitive, and developmental correlates they have. And I want to be a bit more precise. The logic of this is how it works in my view. The idea is that there are some traits, again, personality, motivational traits, and developmental traits that are related to life history trade-offs. There are other traits that are not directly related to life history trade-offs, but have to do with the regulation of defensive mechanisms. And anxiety, fear, disgust, sadness, and a lot of negative emotions have this quality of being essentially self-protective mechanisms. There are going to be some correlations, not entirely straightforward correlations. The argument is these two clusters of traits, through a number of pretty distinct etiological pathways, can explain a lot of why disorder outcomes hang together in the way they do. The argument is not that life history-related traits are the explanation for the onset of disorder outcomes. This is really about the structure. It's not about the explanation of individual disorder. It's about the way we can account for broad patterns of comorbidity and potentially make sense of some heterogeneity lineage. So to illustrate what I'm arguing in a bit more detail, here there are four main ways. This is really an approach to how you can go from individual differences really to disorder outcomes. And the other twist is these individual differences in this model are patterned on the basic fast versus slow dimension. So one way these individual differences can translate into disorder outcomes is that some adaptive traits may actually be regarded as symptoms. And there's a case for that, for example, psychopathy and other socially exploitative strategies, and also on occasion aversive but adaptive defenses, for example, some forms of anxiety and depression and so on. At the same time, some traits that are adaptive up to a point may actually be expressed at maladaptive levels or dysfunctional levels. And these might come across by any combination of genetic plus environmental factors that push the phenotype in the same direction. Assortative mating is going to have, I think, a pretty big role in this kind of disorders. So the idea here is that adaptive traits are not causing the disorder themselves, but when they're pushed over some kind of threshold, it can result in disorder outcomes. The other connection is that some adaptive strategies might be designed in a way to yield occasionally individually maladaptive outcomes. So the strategy is adaptive on the whole, so on average, but individuals might suffer from dysfunctions or even biological maladaptive outcomes for any number of reasons. These are just examples, by the way. So one possibility is maladaptive learning. All learning mechanisms to be effective in the real world have to be vulnerable to some sorts of mislearning. And of course, CBT and cognitive approaches have done a lot of work on how learning about oneself and the environment and others can misfire. And then one other example of this would be defenses that are generally regulated to maybe activate with a certain, more easily than, to trade off between false positive, false negatives in a way that make them likely to activate even when they're not strictly needed, and sometimes potentially even activate to an extent that is damaging for the individual, even if the strategy itself on the whole remains adaptive. And fourth, this is the most indirect pathway, but can still give you some leverage for describing structure. The fourth pathway is that some adaptive traits might not be pathological themselves and be expressed at adaptive levels, but they might increase the vulnerability to some specific dysfunctions. For example, if part of your individual makeup is a tendency for, let's say, your dopaminergic system to be particularly active and reactive, well, that might expose you to some specific disorders if you happen to carry some mutations that interfere with that, or some sources of dysfunction, for example, pathogens, early infections, or sources of chronic stress and so forth. So if you take these four pathways into account, you have a broad map of how individual differences that follow a generally adaptive kind of shape can, in different ways, translate into disorder outcomes. The other extensions I'm making to initial ideas on life histories as an organizing principles is the argument that when we understand human life history strategies, we need to broaden our view a little bit. Let me check the time. Okay. And I'll be again very quick, but just to give you an idea of how this could be done. So the standard life history model really is predicated on a generic kind of animal model in which fast life histories are risky, competitive, mating-oriented, and then the slow life history are basically oriented to caregiving and cooperation and so on. Well, in humans, so my argument is that there are some innovation in our social systems that actually broaden the spectrum of potential ways to get the same general life history outcomes. To illustrate, one thing that's actually, I think, crucial for humans is that status hierarchies are not just based on dominance and coercion. And actually, it's been argued and demonstrated very well that we do have some part of our dominance hierarchies are based on so-called dominance, meaning essentially threat and coercion and physical coercion to some extent. But we also have so-called prestige hierarchies. It's kind of a dual system, and prestige is about competence, value. It's not status that's gained by threat and coercion, but it's conferred by others because of your usefulness to the group or other people. Well, and that changes the trade-offs to some extent, because of course, one way to, for example, gain mating opportunities is to engage in physically dominant behavior and aggressive behavior. That's a standard model. But there's also another two ways in which life history goals can be achieved that don't depend on the usual caregiving versus competitive aggression pathway. And one is investment in creativity and courtship skills. That would be linked to openness and imagination in standard personality models. And on the other hand, we can actually gain prestige and social status not by being, for example, socially interesting or physically dominant, but by possessing useful technical skills. And the idea here is that some traits like it's called systemizing, which is associated with a reduction in openness and imagination, may actually help some people gain status by technical proficiency and not the standard competitive pathways that other animals have. This is one interesting thing. The other interesting innovation is that we can now transfer resources across multiple generations in a way that few other animals can do. And because of that, what I'm arguing is that the standard emphasis on life history models, on slow life history as oriented to parenting and caregiving, so direct caregiving, must be supplemented by the idea that we can do indirect parental investment without necessarily engaging in much caregiving, and historically this has been more of a male biased kind of strategy. You can actually do quite a bit of useful parental investment, not by caregiving, but by provisioning and providing eventually wealth and possession that can be inherited. And is that the case? Again, there are pathways, for example, that would obtain the same kind of outcomes the standard slow life history strategies are designed to obtain, but not by agreeableness and nurturance and caregiving, but by a completely different route that goes through technical skill and indirect investment. And you expect this to be made biased to some extent. So the idea is that, okay, this is really a very brief presentation, but the broad picture is that the standard idea, you have one fast and slow continuum with this standard correlate, can be extended by locating and describing some what I call profiles within fast strategies and within slow strategies that might actually achieve some of the same broad functional goals with different behavioral and cognitive correlates. So this, of course, is more speculative, that the evidence is on. There's some evidence, but it's not as good. So I'm proposing it as a partly speculative extension. We will see how that goes. But the idea is that you can supplement the basic model of life history variation with an extended model. And the extended model would be within the broad domain of fast strategies, where you have more impulsivity, risk-taking. So the standard traits still apply. But I propose to differentiate between like the standard view, which I call an antagonistic exploitative profile, and what I suggest calling a seductive creative profile that has to do more with courtship, verbal ability, artistic creativity, and lower level of aggression. And if you want to map that onto predisposition for some disorders, the prototype of the antagonistic strategy would be psychopathy, which has been argued other times as a kind of manifestation of fast strategies in humans. On the other side of this bifurcation, you have traits like narcissism and schizotypy, in which the defining traits really are, you find correlation with increased mating effort, you find associations with, again, aggression and risk-taking and so forth, but they're not marked by aggression and exploitation. It's more of a pattern of lower aggression and more social skill-based, mentalistic competition in a way. On the other end of the continuum, I propose you can symmetrically really bifurcate between the standard view, which is I call pro-social and caregiving profile within those strategies, and something that I call skill provisioning, in which basically investment in offspring and family is obtained by gaining status with skills and provisioning indirectly, not with direct caregiving. And the defining traits of this would be increased, technical mechanistic cognition, some cognitive traits like, again, perceptual versus verbal ability, lower level of affiliation, really, and agreeableness, because that's not where the strategy is going, and lower level possibly of imagination as a component of openness to experience. And of course, the defining cluster here is that of autistic-like traits. And I'm going to show more evidence that this fit the model in a while. And then, so this is again a speculative way, but I think effective way to extend the standard view. And I've been proposing again, even more tentatively, because we don't really know a lot about neurobiology, unfortunately, that some of these variations, so general variation in fast versus slow, I think serotonergic activity is probably the best, candidate for a general dimension of neurobiological differences. And I've been proposing again that things like, for example, oxytocinergic activity, activation of a network in the brain is called default mode network, and other things like dopaminergic, sex hormone, stress physiology can be, to some extent, in a tentative way, be mapped on this model here. So I won't go into detail of that, just to make the case that a model like that allows you to go beyond purely behavioral traits and try to make some progress about how neurobiological differences map on that. Okay, so that's the background. That's the framework to try to make sense of psychopathology by linking predispositions and risk for different disorders to broad dimensions of individual variation. And the current version of it, I call it the FSD model. And it stands for there's three. I propose to that the broadest scale possible for the classification of disorder really is a three-way classification with some overlap. And I propose to distinguish between fast spectrum disorders, and those would be disorders that have functional correlates in the fast spectrum, like, again, impulsivity, risk-taking, precocious sexuality, low levels of agreeableness, and so forth. Some disorders that are actually in the slow spectrum, so you would expect a continuum of risk in which risk for one kind of disorder actually translates into lower risk for the other kind of disorders. And then a class of defense activation disorder in which my definition for that is a cluster of disorders with very high comorbidity with each other, in which the main symptoms, really the core symptoms of the disorders, are excessive, prolonged or high intensity activation of some kind of defensive system. So the idea that these three clusters are really broad clusters of comorbidity, it doesn't tell you much about how the specific disorders and symptoms arise. As you remember, there's many pathways from here to the disorders. It's really about the structure. The idea is that there's reason to think that the defense activation disorders might occur at both ends of the continuum, so they're not strongly aligned with a fast-slow dimension, but you expect them to occur more frequently together with fast spectrum disorders partly because you expect them to be more frequent in environments where there's a lot of, danger and unpredictability. You will probably need more defense upregulation than in slow kind of environments. And these disorders here, so easy to map. The personality traits that's common is neuroticism, of course. And I would argue that the strongest evidence for some neurobiological correlates right now is low GABA activity and some differences in amygdala size and activation. So again, the power of this, if it works, is that you can link not just create clusters of comorbid disorders, but also link them to epidemiological variables. For example, risk for traumatic events, differences in socioeconomic status, instability in the environment, and also you can make some principled predictions about the patterns of sex differences for different clusters of disorders, both as a whole. So for example, you would expect defense activation disorders to be generally more frequent and more severe in females for, again, good functional reasons, and then differentiated patterns of female versus male high prevalence at the fast and slow extreme of the continuum. And for example, you would expect for the slow spectrum more or less balanced sex distributions, maybe some female, slight female bias for prosocial caregiving disorders, and a pretty strong male bias with skill provisioning kind of those spectrum disorders, if there's any, precisely because this suit of characters and traits, you can make a pretty strong case that it's been more adaptive and more beneficial for males than females across our evolutionary history. And this is how you what you do to DSM categories when you look at. So what I've been doing is to basically look at disorders and look at their functional correlates in terms of personality, motivation, developmental patterns, and so on, and see if, you know, to what extent you can map them on these broad clusters. And sometimes you get disorders that fit as a whole pretty consistent. They can be fit in one of the categories, and other times I think this classification gives you tools to pick functional differentiations between clusters of it. So within the same disorders, make distinctions between subtypes or different profiles that are actually linked to functional differences and not just based on symptom correlations. So again, just as a quick overview, on the fast spectrum side, you have antisocial and conduct disorders, a specific cluster of eating disorders I'm going to talk about, and then personality disorders in the borderline narcissistic spectrum. I'm arguing that most of the psychosis spectrum also fits in this cluster, and some cases of it, probably a majority of ADHD can be mapped here, but there's a lot of heterogeneity within ADHD, so it's only partial. On the slow spectrum, I propose that, again, you have one cluster of eating disorders, one cluster of ADHD with strong comorbidity with autism. Some of the autism spectrum disorders are here, and there's also a cluster, though, of both autism and ADHD that doesn't really fit these categories, and they are, I can point to it, but right in the middle, down in the middle, this O, which is basically stands for other, because it's not classified in the models. So I'm arguing that some subsets of ASD and ADHD don't really fit that life history classification. They're more just dysfunction that are mostly related to cognitive traits. I'll talk about that in a minute too. Then obsessive compulsive personality disorders, I argue it's a prototypical slow life history kind of disorder and a subtype of OCD. And the rest of OCD goes into defense activation disorder together with generalized anxiety, depression, phobias, and panic, and PTSD. And of course, you want to be able to make finer distinctions here. So what I'm not saying is that this kind of classification exhausts the problem. It's just a first pass. It's really, and would be already pretty good, in my opinion, if we can have a shot at mapping the large-scale clustering of psychopathology. Of course, you want to go more into details. For example, within defense activation disorders, there's meaningful distinction between, say, distress versus fear-based, and probably some more fine-grained too. Okay, what I'll do now is just make two quick examples of how this works in practice. How we can look at disorders and try to map them onto these clusters. So and I'm going to go very fast, but just give you an idea, and then conclude with consideration of how this model maps on the other, basically the only other successful model of large-scale comorbidity, which is the transdiagnostic model. So for eating disorders, I would argue that the sexual competition model by Riyad and others is the most successful evolutionary approach to eating disorders so far. The idea is that thinness is essentially a cue of youth and reproductive potential. And for a number of interesting confluence of social and cultural factors, modern societies promote a runaway competition for thinness. And the idea is that eating disorder symptoms should be associated with intersexual competitiveness, mating related motives, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence that they do. So it's a good explanation of how eating disorders connect to motivation and also with risk factors and the rise in modern societies that we observe. At the same time, I would argue that there are some limitations. One is that historically and cross-culturally, sexual competitiveness can, definitely plays a part, but there are also examples in which eating disorders have been linked to moral concerns, aesthetic motives that don't really seem to map on mating in any direct way. And then data that for at least anorexia symptoms, there's probably more of a role for pure status competition and this kind of perfectionist traits that, again, align maybe only in part with intersexual competition and may have something to do more with kind of long-term mating probably than kind of short-term mating competition. So my proposal is that first, well, I mean, not particularly original, but the idea that eating disorders are actually the result of multiple mechanisms, multiple possible motivations that can lead people onto these two main vicious circles called self-starvation cycle and rigid person cycle. Some of those, by the way, are not even particularly psychological. Even involuntary weight loss after illness can actually trigger some cycles in people who are predisposed. So you have these two pathways as common final pathways for eating disorder symptoms, and a lot of instability in actually the clinical presentation. This is also something to keep in mind. Just classifying symptoms as bulimia and anorexia doesn't work very well because they're very, very unstable. And by looking at the different symptoms and clusters from the perspective of the FSD model, my proposal is that you can actually identify two main functional subtypes of eating disorders. One is the, again, it's kind of simple fast versus low spectrum thing in which this thing, by the way, recovers something that I think it's very good line of research, which is on personality-related subtypes of eating disorders. These are these under-controlled, over-controlled, and high-functioning subtypes come from that tradition. And the idea is that you have one cluster of eating disorders, which is mostly on the bulimic side, but also anorexia, but mostly definitely shifted on the binging and purging side of symptoms, where the markers are high impulsivity, low agreeableness, and also correlates with externalizing symptoms like aggression, cessation seeking, and so on, and a comorbidity with things like, again, borderline personality, narcissism, and all sorts of, again, defense activation patterns. On the other hand,
Marco, we're running out of time a little bit here.
Sure.
Can I give you one, maybe 2 minutes?
Oh, 2 minutes?
We're going to questions.
No, I took the time wrong. Oh my God. Okay. Let me go. I'll do some magic for you. So this is
well, we do have questions and answers afterwards, but
sure.
Yeah.
Let me use my minutes wisely and just give you the sense of how this works. So the idea is that by differentiating in these ways, for example, the low spectrum eating disorders would have comorbidity with things like obsessive compulsive personality traits, risk for autism, so a slightly different pattern of comorbidities, not just bad, but different association with things like socioeconomic status, maturation timings, and other risk factors, which are, again, highly heterogeneous in eating disorders and not well accounted for in current models. And I would argue there are some neurobiological implications also, for example, about the role of serotonin in eating symptoms, where you can make fine-grained distinctions between the drop in serotonin that you have as a side effect of starvation and the fact that even, for example, recovered anorexic patients tend to show high serotonin levels, and that doesn't really fit with the idea that low serotonin is a risk factor. So I would argue that my framework helps making sense of something like this. I just keep the autism thing entirely. And that's fine. What I want to say in the last minute I have is, so the FSD model does, so one good question is, because the standard trend diagnostic model actually does a pretty good job of mapping correlations between disorders and symptoms, how does the FSD model relate? And my answer is there's some overlap and some differences. So this is a big picture again. So internalizing disorders are of course an overlap with what I call D-type or defense activation disorders, but also absorb some of the other spectra. And so the externalizing spectrum is revealed as less consistent than, for example, the transdiagnostic model would have it, and same for all disorders. Why these differences? Well, because if my argument is correct, many disorders in the DSM have functionally distinct subtypes, and the standard transdiagnostic model just doesn't look within disorders, just maps the correlations. Some sets are functionally unrelated to personality variation and thus not well accounted. And the standard factor analysis, which is used to build transdiagnostic models, misses nonlinear associations. For example, it did that some things like depression and eating disorder may actually increase at both ends of the continuum. I also argue that the P factor can be explained as a mixture, really not as a unitary construct, but as a combination of three things: a fast life history pattern, defense upregulation, high neuroticism, and low cognitive ability. And these three things are not completely independent, but largely independent, and they might at the same time give rise to a P factor in factor analysis, even if there's no such thing at the deeper level of constructs. And I have a simulation study where I actually show that if you simulate data based on the FSD model and then analyze it like people do in transdiagnostic approaches, what you get is exactly a P factor model with externalizing, internalizing, and P without the general factor being anywhere in the generated model. So I think this is very interesting evidence. Okay. How many seconds do I have?
Oh, well, we've got quite...
I'm over time.
I think you're a bit over time, but thank you very much.
And I'm sure with all the shenanigans of trying to get things across the Atlantic working, you can be forgiven for an odd minute here and there. We're lucky to have you at all from that distance.
All right. I'll be very quick. So my conclusions basically is that, I'm arguing that a life history approach may actually help overcome fragmentation in our field. Of course, the framework, I argue, provides the foundation for an alternative classification system, but also this model can actually reproduce the large-scale structure of mental disorders and even reproduce some findings from other models. That's very interesting in my view. And it definitely has potential, if it works, for deeper integration with things like behavior genetics, psychiatric genetics, individual differences, and also the next, in a way, big thing in psychiatry, which is the rise of computational models, which again have a lot of, are making a lot of initial headway, but I think will hit on some real difficulties very shortly. And the only way to get past those difficulties will be to take a functional perspective. So not just seeing more in terms of abstract decision makings, decision maker agents, and generic cost and benefits, but really go deeper into what the motivational structure is and how trade-offs enter the picture, which is yet something that computational models just don't take into account. And something I haven't talked about, but I can talk about, happy to talk about, is there are really nice implications for making sense of epidemiological risk factors and also developmental patterns, and for example, differences the age at onset and life course patterns of some disorders. So, okay, thank you.
We'll now take questions from the audience. Riyad's going to ask the first question.
Thank you very much, Marco. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work and a big fan of your book as well. And just to say that, can you hear me, Marco?
Yes, sure. I hear very well.
Hear me. Okay. And just to say that there will be a review, a short review of Marco's book in the next newsletter of the of EPSIG. A couple of just quick questions. One is, what would you say to the argument that the modern environment produces an unusually slow life history, or encourages an unusually slow life history in humans, which is unprecedented? You have to invest 25, 30 years to get to a goal or a career or whatever, which was never the case in the ancestral environment, and that in itself may be producing a mismatch with even a modest fast history strategy inclination. That's one. And the second is, in your book, you suggest that one of the characteristics of the fast cluster is that they get better with age, whereas that they get better with advancing age.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, whereas the slow cluster, they get worse with age. Now, why would you say that the slow cluster gets worse with age?
Okay, yeah, or let me start from the second question. So, right, so the argument is a bit more nuanced, actually. So the idea here is that my summary would be that, so for fast, spectrum-related things, you would actually expect, to the extent that some disorders are particularly linked to things like mating competition, for example, in status competition, you would expect, for example, an onset in relatively early on, probably middle childhood is when I argue this really starts, and then adolescence, young adulthood. So this is not a new argument, really. For example, for psychosis, it's been proposed that there's a window or risk that really matches the peak in mating and social competition. My argument for slow spectrum disorder is not really that they get worse with age. It's more that you don't expect a similarly peaked and concentrated window of onset. So you expect, generally speaking, something that's a bit more spread out over the life course. And actually, my argument for there's actually a twist to that, and the twist is for things like autistic traits, so the disorders in the autistic spectrum, where one way of, and I think there's some nice evidence that one thing that's going on in the autism spectrum cluster is a developmental delay. Some things that usually happen on a certain task schedule are actually delayed, both in a cognitive sense and on a motivational sense. For example, people in the spectrum tend to have, sexual interests that arise much later than most people. They get interested in sexual relations and partners, a romantic relationship later than other people do. So it's kind of slow developmental trajectory. And actually, the argument there would be that, to some extent, for some clusters of trait there, you might actually have, instead of a young adulthood peak in the symptoms, then that then get slowly better across time, you might actually have a very early onset, and then you expect some symptoms to get better later than they get better in fast spectrum disorders. Because in fast spectrum disorders, basically the peak of the symptoms is when the competition is strongest, and then they get better. For, let's say, the slow pattern, you expect symptoms to be, more specific. So you don't expect a peak in early reproductive age. What you can make a prediction is that when people in this kind of spectrum of traits actually get to mating and mating competition, which is usually later than other people do, some of the symptoms will actually get a bit better. For example, on the social side, and there's some evidence that autistic traits actually tend to improve a little bit with age in an interesting way that I think kind of fits the pattern. But so I'm not making just a symmetric prediction where fast symptoms peak in young age and slow symptoms peak later on. It's more, there's less of a strong criterion to expect the fast spectrum things to all cluster in between, say, middle childhood and young adulthood. Does it make sense?
Yep.
It's strange to...
First question. What about my first question?
Oh, the first question. Yeah. So current environment. I don't have a well-defined theory about that. I think you can make a case. There's two symmetric things, really. One is that, at least in some social settings, so I don't think it's a universal thing, it really socially stratified. In some social setting, you do have this premium on very slow development, even very late reproduction, so there might be something to that too. And also environments that tend to become incredibly safe and predictable by any standards. And some people have argued it's possibly even too safe and too predictable to actually be healthy in a way. So to the extent that fits into life history development, you could expect that modern societies in some social strata may actually be pushing for kind of an exaggeration of some, let's say, slow development patterns. At the same time, there's also one of the key mismatches, which is again contraception and abortion. So the decoupling between mating effort and actual reproductive success. And so for example, the reproductive correlates of, let's say, fast versus slow strategies may actually be a bit weird too, in the sense that some personality traits that you would expect to correlate with kind of in the fast spectrum, like again, openness, creativity, extroversion, might not necessarily be conducive to reproduction. And some traits that might have in earlier ages probably curtailed your reproductive output a bit, like high agreeableness and nurturing and conscientiousness. Right now, they seem to be switching to predictors of higher fertility. But of course, you have a massive mismatch in the coupling between mating and actual reproduction. So that's also true. So you have, an interesting, it's a push to fast, it's like a premium on slow strategies in some social strata. You might argue that there's a push toward fast strategies in other, social contexts. So there might be a little bit of a kind of disruptive thing going on. And at the same time, the actual reproductive outcomes might be not the ones you would expect just based on some kind of the standard ecological model where higher mating tends to lead to higher reproduction.
Marco, can we get you to join our panel now and get the other members of the people that have spoken this morning to come and join us?